We're now going to consider 3 works of sculpture, representation by 3 different artists of the same character and the same story. And we're going to compare and contrast how these particular artists have aligned what they present with the historic written accounts and how they're different. This is 3 Davids. Following the idea of person, object, story, the person was David, the biblical king of Judah, part of the Jewish kingdom centered in Israel, in Jerusalem. The objects are these 3 sculpture representations of David by Donatello, Michelangelo, and Bernini. And the story is simply the slaying of Goliath by David. But more importantly, in terms of our work, is how is David being presented? So who was David? In Judaism and Christianity, he was to be the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of the Messiah, the Savior of the world. The Messiah was to be a descendant of the lineage and the family of David. In Islam, David is a major prophet of God. And in Baha'i, David is a reflection or a manifestation on earth of God. The qualities that David would possess would be the positive qualities of God. So what we know from historic accounts, from ancient writings, from biblical writings, David was a shepherd. He was a son of Jesse. That's important to know who he was the son of, because in the Jewish history, there's a great deal of importance placed upon family lineage and connections to God and God's purposes through families over centuries and millennia. So he was a son of Jesse. He fought Goliath and won. He entered the service of King Saul after that, and that service included playing harp music for Saul, because historians believe that Saul suffered from migraines, and the harp music soothed him. He was best friends with King Saul's son Benjamin. He became eventually a brave leader in service of the king and the nation in all the various battles and wars that were going on at that time. Eventually, because David's fame began to increase, Saul became jealous of him, and Saul actually went out, pursued and hunted him down, trying to kill him. David eventually became the king of Judah, and then we get into some other interesting things of his life. As when he was king, he committed adultery and murder, so this way he could marry Bathsheba. The story is that one day David went out to one of his gardens on top of his palace, and he saw in another building, on another open garden area, Bathsheba, a very beautiful woman. He decided that he wanted her, and they committed adultery. And eventually, David came up with a scheme to kill Uriah to cover up his infidelity. Uriah was one of David's generals, and he placed Uriah at the head of a battle and had the troops withdrawn back of him, so Uriah was slain in war. David is the author and composer of numerous psalms, and these are biblical songs and poems of petition and praise to God. He was the father of Solomon. You probably know the wisdom of Solomon, but he was the father of Solomon, and David gave Solomon the plans for the famous temple that Solomon would eventually build. So, how is David being represented here? Just to give us a little bit of information about David, this is a 19th century sculpture on the side of a cathedral in Salisbury, England, by the English sculptor James Redfern. It was created in 1869. And it's showing David as a king with his crown, with his royal cape, with his brooch that's holding together parts of his cape, his long flowing robes, which again are a symbol of wealth and royalty of the time. You don't have clothing like that unless you're a wealthy person. But very importantly, he's looking out. He's being shown as an old, mature man. But he's carrying his harp. That harp and his music and the connection with God throughout David's entire lifetime was very important. So that's an important element to be placed in here. Notice the Corinthian influence capitals on top of the pillars next to the niche. Again, that's something going from the Greeks to the Romans, and then eventually When the cathedral builders of the Middle Ages were creating those wonderful cathedrals in Europe, they used that Roman-style architecture, and they used the columns and the capitals appropriately. So let's just look for 1 second, just a little farther into the life of David, because David was holding a harp and music in that Renfeld sculpture. And we're going to take a look at one of the songs here, one of the Psalms for a moment. So this is an excerpt from the book of Psalms, Tehillim, or Praises. These are songs sung in Jewish worship. This is an excerpt from Psalm 51, and this is from a Masoretic text, which is an official authorized English translation from the original Hebrew. It starts off, there is a small set of instructions or context that's actually written into the psalm, the start of the psalm itself, sort of like a prelude or a preface. For the leader, a psalm of David, because in addition to the psalms David wrote, the other people wrote psalms as well. And this is when Nathan the prophet came into him after he had gone into Bathsheba. In other words, after David had committed adultery with Bathsheba. So this is a psalm where David is petitioning God to forgive him for the sin that he had created. Be gracious unto me, O God, according to thy mercy. According to the multitude of thy compassions, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Just a historic note, according to the historians, Bathsheba became pregnant after she slept with David. And so my sin is ever before me is compelling and built into that. So let's take a moment and consider the story of David slaying Goliath. You have access to the story of David slaying Goliath. If you have not read this story yet, please do so now. Stop this video and read so now, because the story gives the historic context of David as a young boy shepherd who comes into a war camp where King Saul's army is fighting the Philistines, learns that Goliath, the huge, massive, and amazing warrior that's a Philistine, could not be beaten. King Saul believes that all is lost. David volunteers for the job to kill Goliath. At first he's not taken seriously, but then he becomes taken seriously, and eventually David does slay Goliath. So now we're going to consider 3 interpretations of David as a young hero, the savior of the Jewish nation in Judah, where King Saul was the king at the time. We have Donatello, a Renaissance artist. We have Michelangelo, a Renaissance artist. And we have Bernini, a Baroque artist from the period who came after the Renaissance. We're going to take a look at each of these 3 representations. We're going to see what's included, what's not included. We're going to compare it a little bit to the text, the storyline, and we're going to see what's important to these artists in presenting these stories. So, for considering each work, how did the artist represent David? What are the details of David slaying Goliath that are included in the sculptures? This is very important. How is lifelikeness and motion implied? How is line seen in these works? And how do artists use space to tell a story? And what are some influences in the way each work is presented? We're going to begin with David by Michelangelo. He created it 1501 to 1504. It was commissioned for the Florence Cathedral. And he actually created this work out of a discarded piece of marble, a discarded piece of stone that another artist had begun working on. Michelangelo was a young artist at the time, not very wealthy, and so this was the piece of stone that was given to him in order to be able to create this work. It was designed to be placed along the roof line of the Florence Cathedral. So as you walk up to the Florence Cathedral, you look upwards, you see David, one of the venerable characters of ancient times in the story of the church. In the image on the left, there is a portrait by a colleague of Michelangelo named Jacopone de Conti, and it was painted sometime after 1535, certainly well after David was created by Michelangelo. But there's always interesting details. For example, take a look at Michelangelo's left hand that's being extended slightly there. You notice how knobby his knuckles look, how swollen they look. That comes about from a whole career of using a stone hammer to carve stone and to do hard work that's sometimes associated with being a sculptor and artist. we see hints of that particular swollenness. And again, this is a portrait towards the end of Michelangelo's life. But these are things that we can look at and we can read. And this gives us some insight into the man. He was a hard-working artist. He didn't rest on his laurels. On the right-hand side, we have the portrait of the very famous Michelangelo. This is probably, of the pieces by Michelangelo, this is probably one of the two pieces. The other one is the roof of the Sistine Chapel, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and the painting where God is reaching out to Adam. That's another work by Michelangelo you probably would recognize, or at least have seen along the way at some point. So, what do you notice about the way this is presented? How does it look? And what does it remind you of? Let's take a look at the elephant in the room, so to speak. There's no clothing on David, is there? This is part of the Greek concept of beauty that came from hundreds of years prior to this. Michelangelo was trying to satisfy the desires and wishes of his patron, who were Italians of the time of the Renaissance period, and they looked backwards to the Greeks for what was beautiful and just and noble. And in the same way that Aristotle defined beauty, those characteristics are seen in the human figure. And again, there is no clothing on David. So that's probably the first thing you notice. You notice the curliness of his hair, which is, it's in some of the historic accounts concerning him. You'll also notice that there's like a tree stump in back of his right leg. As we're facing it, it's the leg on the left, but it's his right leg. A tree stump that's actually used to help support this particular artwork. The sculptors figured out that they didn't have some kind of extra support like that. Sculptures and various types of statuary would break off at the ankle, so to speak, and so that's the reason why that tree stump is there. You'll also notice that Michelangelo's right hand looks a little bit large. Again, the reason for this has to do with the way we see things in perspective. This work was intended to sit on the roof line of the Florence Cathedral, and in order to make it look right and balanced, Michelangelo had to elongate and expand and reshape certain parts of a piece of sculpture in order to make it look correct from standing on the ground looking up. So again, we see the Greek influence. We see him being presented. Also, it's kind of interesting. He's sort of looking off at a distance. He's not fighting at the moment. He's not bending down by the brook to get his 5 smooth stones that he's going to use as weapons against Goliath in his shepherd's sling, the very weapon that he used to kill wolves and protect his sheep. But he's sort of looking off. He's thinking. Something is about to happen. He's thinking. Because it's a sculpture in 3-dimensional, we have a front view and a back view, and here's the front view on the left and the back view on the right. Again, the anatomy is phenomenal. The musculature, the shape of the bones, underneath the flesh, everything is there. There's not 1 ounce of fat on this young man. We see more details of the tree stump on the back, and we also now notice that that thing in his left hand is actually part of the sling. You can see the leather thongs of the sling extending over his back. We see more of the detail on his hair, on the back of his head. We also get a stronger sense of how he's leaning on his right leg, and his body weight is being supported. And this is giving again a sense of lifelikeness to the sculpture. Some of the details. Take a look at the right hand. Notice how beautifully shaped and crafted it is. Notice the veins in his hand. Notice how the bones of the joints are underneath his skin. Notice his thumbnail of his hand. Again, some really nice details. Again, look at on the right side of his gaze. He is thinking. He is contemplating. He's looking off to a distance. He is thinking about what's going to happen next. But also, take a good look at his rib cage. Notice how he's very sleek, muscular. Again, not an ounce of fat on him. And he is a young man, probably 19 or 20, 18, 19 or 20, the way Michelangelo is presenting him. Something very important we need to talk about that you will still see in sculpture today is contrapposto, which is an Italian word for counterpose. The weight of the body is on one leg. The hips go in one direction with shoulders in a slightly different direction. It's a very old stance and implies motion and balance, and sometimes it is combined with an S-curve stance to help give that sense of implied motion or something is about to happen. In this particular image, you will see the axis lines, the implied lines and actual lines of the body that have been drawn on the image of this sculpture, just to give you a little bit better idea of how this all works and what's going on inside the human being with the skeletal structure. Here we have David by Donatello. This was created in 1440. It was this early Renaissance. And taking a look at the right, we see David in a bronze sculpture now, not in stone, but in bronze. On the left side, we see Donatello being presented in a Renaissance hat, a Renaissance artist's hat. His clothing is typical of the Renaissance, and in his right hand, we see a hammer of some type that he's going to be using to craft sculptural works. Donatello, well-known sculpture of the time. There are actually two Davids by Donatello. One was a stone sculpture that he created, which is reminiscent of statuary and sculpture from the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages. But this one that we see here on the right in bronze was created after that, and it's the one that we're focusing our attention on. It's the most famous of those two. We see this being a Renaissance work specifically, showing the idealization of the human body. Here we have the front and the rear view of this particular statue. Notice how smooth the skin is. Look at this young man. This is not a 19 or 20-year-old. This is a 12 or 13-year-old young boy being presented here. Look at his musculature, the way his body is formed. Again, this is seeking to represent what might have been at the time, according to what historians say about the age of David at the time he slew Goliath. But there's a lot of non-ancient things as well. That particular hat that he's wearing with the floral ornament on it, that's from Renaissance Italy. Also take a look at the sword that he's carrying. That was the sword that he stole from Goliath after he had killed Goliath to cut Goliath's head off. That's from Renaissance Italy as well. Great amount of detail on the head of Goliath as he's standing with his foot on top, and the leggings that he has, the protective legging. But again, even though he has some clothing, his main portion of his body is being presented in an ideal fashion. Again, this is the influence of Greek sculpture showing through. Take a look at the hat again for the moment. Those floral decorations that the Greeks, the Romans, and then the Italians were very fond of. But again, this hat is not from the Middle Ages, or probably not from the Middle East. It is from the Renaissance period. His hair is very detailed, long flowing locks. Again, the style that would have been worn by young boys in the early Renaissance period in Italy. His face is of a young teenager. Here we have some very interesting detail work at the foot of the statue. We have the head of Goliath after it's been cut off by David. We see him in his helmet. His eyes are shut. We see the details of his beard and the ground that he's laying on. We see the engraving on his helmet. We also see the details of the sandals that David is wearing and the tooling, the leather tooling and that, showing great details as well. It's an interesting contrast to the smoothness of the skin of David and the immense amount of detail on these particular aspects of the sculpture. The third David that we are going to consider is by Bernini, and in this particular one we're going to be able to see the difference of attitude or approach that an artist of the Baroque period would take. With the Baroque artist, it's about realism, it's about struggle, it's about the intensity of life. Whereas with the Renaissance works and Renaissance artists, it's all about how we idealize things. In the case of the Italians, the way the Greeks idealized things, and then how the Italians and Romans borrowed from that. But here we have a different kind of work being presented here. An intense, realistic work from the early Baroque period, from 1624. In 1623, Bernini painted his self-portrait, and you can see his self-portrait there. You notice immediately the difference in the style of clothing. You also see his age. He's a very young man at the time. Maturing artist and very well liked, but again, a very young artist. On the left side, we see our initial impression of David by Bernini. And it does have a very, very different kind of look to it. Immediately, for one thing, the stance is one of great motion and action, ready to take place. In these two images of the sculpture of David by Bernini, we see a lot of phenomenal, great details. We're going to talk about those here right now. Let's go to the picture on the right, which is the back side of the sculpture. We see the sling, the binding of the rope itself. We see the rock that's been placed in the sling. This is going to be the weapon that David is going to use to kill Goliath with. We see a very strange looking object, and if you look at it closely enough, you begin to realize it's some type of piece of clothing piled up on the ground, and he's standing over it. That's actually a suit of armor from the Middle East of David's time. This was a suit of armor that was King Saul's personal armor that he offered to David to protect him while he fought Goliath. But David said, no, I can't use that armor because it will slow me down. I need to be able to fight in the way I'm accustomed to fighting without the armor. But we do have the armor present in the particular work. Notice the details on the hair, the details on the skin. The clothing that he is wearing is a very simple shepherd's loincloth, something that he would have worn at the time. Notice the details on the back of his legs, the strength of the muscles, in his arms. Again, these are all some very phenomenal details we see in this particular work. Let's go over to the left for a second. We see David from the front. We see his jaw set very strongly. We see his body curled over, ready to hurl the rock at Goliath. We see more details of the armor. We see more details of his clothing. And we see the pouch in which, according to historians and texts, that David placed the stones that he used to kill Goliath with. Very simple kind of pouch with a leather thong going over his opposite shoulder. Here we see a close-up of David's head. We see the hair, we see the face, we see some of the muscles of the face. Some interesting details, the details of the hair on his eyebrows, the way the muscles in his face, the way his jaw is clenched. He is ready for battle and combat. And it's a wonderful detail that we can see from this particular angle. Again, it's that realism and intensity in life struggle that Bernini was trying to portray. Here we have another view of David from another slightly different angle, where we can see more of the strength of his muscles, the muscles in his arms, the muscles in his torso, the core of his body, so to speak, if we were speaking of him as an athlete. Also notice the details on his legs, the muscles on his legs, the details on his hands and his feet. We also see some more additional details on King Saul's armor that he's standing over. So based on what we've observed, there's some important things that we can take away from this. First of all, artists will portray subject matter, in this case David, from particular perspectives. In the case of the two Renaissance works, the Donatello work and the Michelangelo work, they're presenting the body of David as an idealized human body. In the case of Bernini, the Baroque artist, the body is a little bit more realistic and shows a bit more of the action and the intensity of the moment and the struggle that's going on. In the case of Bernini, we have fairly historically accurate clothing for David. We also have his sling, and we have the armor of Saul. Again, this is from a different part of the story. In the case of Michelangelo, we have a point where either David is going to the brook to get the stones, or he has just gotten the stones and he's considering what's going to happen next in terms of the battle. But again, in that work, the human body is presenting without clothing in the idealized Greek manner. Not in a realistic manner, but in an idealized manner. And again, we have someone who's maybe 19 or 20 years old perhaps, or 18 or 19 or 20, as opposed to the young man, the boy, of Donatello, that historians believe he was, the young teenager. But even in that work, in terms of research, we have an Italian Renaissance hat that he's wearing. And we have an Italian-style sword from the Renaissance period. So artists will pick and choose what they choose to present to satisfy their patrons, to satisfy expectations, and to create things that are fitting in with their environment and their way of seeing the world. The objects they create have to tell the story in the way that they want to tell the story. So with the two Renaissance pieces, we were trying to satisfy particular patrons that wanted idealized Davids. With the case of Bernini's David, we have Bernini working to satisfy a patron who wanted that bigger-than-life drama of the life or death struggle between David and Goliath. These all come into play when presenting a story. But one thing to remember is that all of these details are things that we can catalog, we can make lists of, we can make notes of, because they will help us to be able to interpret the artworks and to attach that story between person, object, and story that we believe so strongly in. And what's the best point to start? Probably the very best point in any particular artwork is the phenomena of what we see and what we experience. In other words, what's in front of us. Make a good detailed catalog of that. Historic information and other works to place it in a context that can come later. But the first step is to make a very good, clear, detailed catalog of everything we observe and see.